Echoes, Chapter 1, page 245. He stood without moving, not a muscle, and listened to the ailing rabbi as chickadees and starlings churned the sky above. If he'd known his birds, he could have identified them by their sounds as they ventured out from the tall pines and maples that bordered the cemetery. It was still early enough that mourning doves could be heard cooing softly and confidently, set with folded wings as they observed the small group huddled beneath them. But he did not notice these birds any more than they knew or cared that the dead woman had no family other than the husband who had come here to bury her at the beginning of this beautiful August day. Nor would they see any children except for the blonde-haired girl with beautiful hands, or friends other than Bella or Eva Zasbo, leaving only the retired carpenter who had helped reshape the Bolholm, and the Japanese woman who seemed to be looking at all this as if through a lens, not her own two eyes. The highway passed just north of where this silent group now stood. The few cars that moved along it disturbed the air only slightly, heard at a distance of a couple hundred yards of open field. Off to the left the burnt river valley opened grandly on the far side of a sudden, brief, but dense wall of trees. Often children slid down its shale, slick incline to where junk tires were scattered amongst other refuse, but no children played there today. This cemetery had seen larger, more worshipful crowds, but Anton Bohl noticed none of this. He didn't notice the birds, and he didn't notice the young girl whose name he once had known, and he did not glimpse the blue light through the wall of trees, or think about a river running its course, or the turning of seasons. He did not think about birth or rebirth or the absence of children in his life, but only about the end of things. None of this was surprising. He had time to prepare himself for this moment, but now that it was here, he did not know what conclusions he was supposed to have drawn. He was not able to conjure the small, comforting notion that his wife had lived fully, and girded herself for death. If ever he had determined such a thing, he was unable to recall any preferred means of committing his beloved to the earth. Was there a right thought to think at a time like this, he wondered? A corner in his mind where he had stored some secret hope, some warm, lasting memory that might sustain the survivor. He would not have remembered, for example, had he asked himself why he insisted that Emiko stay at the house. It was uncharacteristic, inviting others into a life he had kept by inclination and training private. Was it for himself he had requested of her these extra few days, possibly to lessen the burden? Surely Bella and Eva, as his oldest and most reliable friends in this town, and perhaps anywhere, would have made themselves available. But he did not know, because he was unable or unwilling to ask himself. And so for the time it took to commit his wife's remains, he forgot the will of God's design. If it could be seen in these terms, as on this one occasion, he would have preferred it to be. Instead, he remembered only his grief and confusion. The moment he had long anticipated was upon him. That was all he knew. The moment they had anticipated together, he was now walking through. He remembered Sophie's words. "When I am gone," she used to say, "when I am gone." But that possibility had never seemed real, not with her there, breathing, holding his hand. "Your life will not end when I'm gone," she once told him. "You could even meet someone. Take that as my final blessing." "Funny woman," he said, smiling and shooing away this offering, an idea like a plate of unwanted sweets. What was done was done. There was no urgency today. This last tribute would be given with as few words and thoughts as possible. As the small semicircle formed, he looked up and tried to offer a smile of thanks. The rabbi's presence was Eva's suggestion. He was a tall man, uncertain on his feet because of either old age or some unstated illness which might have clung thickly to the backs of his dark and weary eyes, lowered to the ground now as if anticipating their own descent into blindness. Anton watched, wondering how close he, or each of them here, was to death. That was a privilege of the living, this awareness of your own mortality, even in the midst of grief. Even then. He knew this from experience. Straightening, he moved through the rest of the ceremony as gracefully as possible. He would give his wife this last noble portrait of the man she had married, silent in his suffering. He looked up from the casket to see Emiko standing on his right, seemingly transfixed. She suffered her own losses, he knew, and would understand this instinctively. A woman well versed in the intimacy of pain. Maybe she was the only one present who truly understood why he had brought her here. She would remember and remind him, if he were to ask. Perhaps it was fitting that she be in attendance, mourning a woman who had experienced such an oddly shaped rash on the same day 50 years ago as she, Emiko, had felt those unnatural scars riot across her body. Perhaps at the same instant he'd heard stories of such lively coincidence, almost fable-like in their synchrony and monstrous beauty. But Anton would not relegate such mystic portent to the realm of the impossible, or even the unlikely, despite the fact that he had bound himself to the reason of science and the reverence of logic. He lowered his eyes again to the coffin. Yet this notion would not be dislodged. Such a deeply felt connection between these two women, one lying lifelessly before him, the other standing here in the best suit of mourning that could be rummaged up in a matter of hours. Was this why Sophie had been so insistent about this woman's interview? That they be as thorough as possible, as deep as her husband's memory would permit, and that in order to accomplish them the woman should postpone her own plans while she tended to the ramblings of an old man. Anton accepted Emiko's offer of a drive back to the house. She waited for him while he crossed the parking lot to tell Bella, whom he'd come with, and watched him gently touch his neighbor's shoulder. He climbed in beside her and stared straight ahead without speaking. She didn't attempt to engage him. "Thank you," he said. She maneuvered the car out into the familiar streets of his town, turning onto Douglas Avenue, then Palmer, past Jackson's Hill, and finally onto Spruce Street. The old Victorian homes here were invariably large, shaded under tall oak and birch, children playing on front yards and sidewalks. The breeze that flowed through the open car windows smelt of freshly cut grass. He didn't receive people after the service, not that there were many to receive. Even if there had been, he would have preferred silence. Emiko brought a plate of cold cuts and sliced tomatoes out to the back patio and set it on the table at which Anton sat watching the lake. Dark clouds were moving in now, after a brief sun shower, creating a vivid rainbow over the horizon. He looked to her and managed a smile, but showed no more interest in her or the food. The golden light filled the garden shadows while its figures seemed to come alive, their presence growing in the rain-thickened air. When the heavy rain began then in earnest, he moved indoors and watched from the window as the lake bubbled and peened and popped and the rain steamed the air. A tremendous roar beat down on the flagstones and roof of the house, and the raindrops slapping against the leaves of the trees raised a chorus of tiny drums in his ears. When the storm finally ended and the returning sun laid its early evening shadows across the wet lawns, Anton pulled open the sliding doors and walked stiffly into his wife's garden through a thrum of cycadas and sparrows. He'd heard Emiko leave the house through the back door. She was out here. He'd heard the harsh snapping of garden shears. When Emiko heard the door slide open and shut, she imagined he was coming to thank her for staying on. That would be it. Then she could leave. She lowered the shears to her side and waited as he circled the bushes, strolling without hurry. She listened for the slow shuffle of the aged, the imminently infirm. She knew his habitual posture, hands clasped behind his back like a grandfather out for an evening stroll, stopping to pause and test the air. He stopped on the opposite side of the cypress hedge and watched Emiko spear the wet earth with the open shears. Together they walked between the line of cherry trees leading down to the edge of the garden, where the shadows had already fastened themselves like silent ravens onto the sculptured ferns, and side by side they settled on one of the turquoise cast-iron benches facing the lake. After he'd rested, they walked down the shoreline to the pier at the mouth of the burnt river. Near the edge, he said, "She made me promise her. She asked for my help. Sophie wanted me to help her die." All around them, men were casting lines into the coming sunset. With September approaching, the salmon run had begun. The fishermen were scattered loosely along the length of the pier. The one nearest them reached into a sack and produced a small bottle, which he opened on a red and white lure held tightly in a clenched fist. It popped and fizzed, and the cap bounced against the pier. Soon it would be dusk. Perhaps 20 minutes remained before the sun, suspended like a jewel over their right shoulders, initiated its rapid descent, and the nighttime quiet settled over the water. The light breeze was trailing off now, and as far as the eye could see the surface had already assumed its patient vigil. Many hours Anton had spent out here with Sophie. He remembered how she'd carry the old rod he found for her at a garage sale, clenching it like some heavy garden maul. It was a different sort of fishing from the type he pursued alone farther upriver, a relaxing of the rules they'd implicitly agreed upon, as it had been when he helped her with her plants. More than anything else, it was an excuse to enter the other life for a small moment, this walk out to the pier at sunset. Fishing was not the point. They'd watch the sunset fire the entire sky, moved by this vast presence, and this shared spectacle seemed to lift the gray ribbon of unease that had brushed against them for so long. "I helped her die," he said again. "Can you understand that? She had nothing left. I knew what the doctors would have done. I couldn't have saved her, but she didn't want that. I could have saved her, but she didn't want that. He wanted Emiko to say, yes, in such a case there are limits to the suffering we should endure when responsibility falls to the living to help those who can no longer. But instead, I'm sorry. Only that. So this was the mystery, Emiko thought. Here was a man guilty of helping his wife end her suffering. A terrible thing, yes, that blood on your hands, but how many were forced unnaturally to make such a choice? How common was such suffering the necessary end to a cancerous or crippled or simply old, wasting existence? The lake rose and fell in broad, shallow sheets, gently and unrushed, like echoes from a distant and unheard shuddering of the earth deep below. This cannot go well, he thought. Let this go. Anton turned away. But if she asked you to help her, she said suddenly, as if she'd been thinking this through those last silent minutes, that's some consolation. She asked you. She knew what was coming. Yes, he said, it was like that. If she asked, she was ready. So that was your last gift to her. You can be comforted to know that. They watched the thinning of light against the darkening wall of sky. The lake blushed and turned a fiery orange that cast a purple and gold halo around the men standing by the lighthouse. Both hands in his pockets, with the fingers of his right, Anton massaged a single packet of sugar that remained there. Walking back up, he stood in the middle of a path and said the names of the plants, touching each as he spoke. Yarpon holly, bluebell, dianthus. He had learned these from his wife. Creeping ivy, forsythia. I remember something remarkable from that time, though, he said. Suddenly the cornflowers and gladiolas came up while I was there, in the city, after 2 weeks or so. Morning glories and lilies, colors bursting up. He leaned forward to smell a flower cradled in his hand. Only the day before, Hiroshima had been charcoal, nothing left. I saw it, but such beauty came so suddenly. We were all taken aback. The whole team noticed it. It was quite unheard of for flowers to grow there. He turned then and raised his hand to touch her face. She stopped herself from stepping away. His open palm rested there. She felt an unusual electricity, a warmth on his hand that moved into her face and into the bones of her mouth. She took his hand in her own and placed it more squarely there, where the scar had been repaired. He offered no resistance, and his fingers tingled as he guided them over her skin, as if introducing himself to a newly blinded man. She felt the warmth coming through his touch, the slightly sticky night sweat, the small dead points on her skin near the left eye. She raised his other hand to her opposite cheek. "What you've done," she said. "Can you feel it?" He dropped his hand to his side and nodded. "I know what I have done. I remember when you were still a young girl, when Bertrand Russell spoke out that first time, the news from the Bikini Atoll." He paused. "You know who Edward Teller was? Tell me. Let me tell you something. He was pushed out of the H-bomb program after leading it for 3 years, but obviously he wanted to know if all his work had been successful. He had no way of knowing at that time. He wasn't allowed to attend the tests out in the South Pacific because he'd been blackballed. By now he was at Stanford. So he went to the seismology building that day. and listened to the echoes. This was the only way he could tell whether it had worked. He sat down there in some basement, watching the seismograph. He knew within a minute or two. He saw the little bounce. He knew that was it. He lifted his eyebrows expectantly. A message from the other side of the world. She moved backwards, only slightly. You were already a young woman then. I was watching that night, the night you thanked America for what they'd done for you. You saw that on the television, she said. No, there, in the studio. He concentrated his voice, attempting absolute focus. He wanted her to see that he was not a threat. And then, there you were at my lecture, whatever it was, 3 weeks ago. It was like you were waiting for me, like you'd come looking after all that time, holding out your hand to me. I thought of Teller then, sitting in that little basement, waiting for news. He reached out his hand again. This time she stopped him. When you survive a war, comfort is enough for some, I think. Sophie might have been thankful to me for taking her away from the camp I found her in. Grateful, but not in love. She always knew that, and it haunted her. She knew that long before I knew. She knew me for who I was, and accepted me. But I was unable to help myself. She is not to blame. She waited for me to get on with my life. She waited and waited. We were tired. Already as young people, we were tired. Do you regret helping her the way you did? She said. Is that what you're saying? I did what I could for her. You helped her. She asked for your help. Yes, but some things you push away, she said. You blame yourself for other things instead. He shook his head dismissively. I do not blame myself for anything. Old age is a foundation of regret, not blame. Tell me, what happened to her family? Emiko asked. They died, I'm not sure. You're not sure? You never found out? Never went back? She thought it best to look forward, he said, as we all did in those days. Did you not? Did you ever know your wife, Professor? That is a ridiculous question. Did you ever think about what she lost in the war? Not just what you had become, but what she'd lost. She was a strong woman. She had no need to look backwards. I knew my wife. Do not presume to speak to me about my wife. Neither moved, each waiting for the other to declare this meeting over and finished. She would be very strong, Emiko said, to stay with you. At that, he only smiled. It was long past midnight now. The shapes, solid and black in the garden beyond the stone pathway. She sat under the arbor, the lake still and glassy under a ringed moon. The door slid open, and he stepped out onto the patio with the old projector from his office and a white bed sheet, maybe pulled down from that mirror, she thought. He set the heavy load on the picnic table and draped the sheet between two cypress branches. Then he ran an extension cord through the sliding doors. She watched curiously, not speaking. In a moment he produced a small wooden box full of old reels. The white sheet moved slowly, rippled by night air, in anticipation of full stillness. Neither spoke as he prepared for what was about to happen. She waited stiffly, wondering what strange relics he was about to reveal. Might there be something new, then? Did this man dole out his memories in increments? When he switched on the projector, a funnel of light directed a square slightly tilted to the left and off-center onto the sheet strung between the branches. It didn't take long for her to see that he'd used that camera for more than he'd admitted to. There were outtakes from as late as the 70s by the look of the cars in the city pieces. He'd continued shooting long after he got back, long after the end of the war and his tour with the Manhattan District. He'd carried this obsession forward through the decades. A protest scene in Central Park, the mayors of Hiroshima and New York City, old men in hats shaking hands, late 60s maybe, then moving backwards and forwards in no particular order. Some minutes of the bombed city, and half a dozen men from the Joint Commission and 3 from the Manhattan District. Himself the fourth, a very young man with jet black hair swished back in the fashion of the day, standing, staring blankly. For the first time it occurred to her that he'd been a good-looking man. The lips were large, expressive. He smoked like a movie star. Then, somehow inserted into the film, there was a still of the 12 men who delivered the bomb to its destination. They wore eager grins, standing before the nose of their flying fortress, playfully elbowing one another in the gut. Let's go get 'em. Then, back in New York, early 70s again. He was changing reels quickly now, a practiced hand. The Daughters of Trinity stood at 66th Street entrance of the park, with cardboard bombs cutting through their hearts and mushroom clouds sprouting like daisies from their heads. An unsmiling group of NYU drama students conducting mock trials of American war criminals, the names of the accused written in blood on a wall-sized backdrop suspended between 2 Japanese cherry trees. 2 mounted cops pulled up on their horses and looked on uneasily while the guilty verdict was passed in the pretend Oppenheimer trial, then trotted them snortingly through the crowd, the mighty haunches rippling with power. Activists hung blood-spattered Macy's mannequins from lamp-posts faster than anyone could cut them down. In accordance with the day, the sun shone atom-packed on this particular material. Whenever it was, maybe a distant 20 years, maybe more, heat radiating through the layers of skin. It was a day of white wooden crosses stuck into the ground and children piddling behind bushes. The camera followed the crowds, jumping, cutting in and out, looking for the shocking, the scandalous, the scarred. She imagined him behind that camera, holding his eyes wide open. A skywriter wove Hiroshima Mon Amour over the Hudson River in red dust, streaming out from the plane's tail, shifting over the street between the cypress branches with the slow drift of New York's wind. The letters became distorted with a few good gusts into the demented, bloody-edged script from the House of Horrors. Then the wind took them away. The sound of the projector clicked and sputtered. Bugs collected in the funnel of light. He'd been witness to some of the best guerrilla theater the city had ever offered. It looked like he'd got it all down, the perverse festival of guilt, the lascivious grease she detested the most. You almost didn't have the right to show up for something like that if you didn't know exactly what it was all about, which no one did. Who did not wear that day on his skin? The lens walked through a spectacle of long hair, bell-bottoms, flowered shirts. It wasn't hard to tell when this might have been, but you might have wondered where all these people came from. the interpreters and delegates and scientists and shame-ridden victims among throngs of the curious and the bored-looking. Maybe they were trying to absorb some of that free pain, heighten the passions, enliven themselves by rubbing up against those who really knew how to suffer. Maybe that's what Anton was doing there. Maybe he got off on this somehow and needed it to keep himself alive. All the sins enacted beneath the wide arc of the sky since the beginning of time were here pinched down into a single week's reckoning, a day filled with speeches and miracle forgiveness and relived nightmares, a week's worth of talks and proclamations and television crews boiled down to a couple of 5-minute reels. This was the day Central Park filled with mothball-scented blankets and beach towels and Porto-San lineups, a feeling magnanimous because here you were soaking up this remorseful feel-good atmosphere in spite of all the inconveniences. Never again, they said. She could hear their chant through the film was mute. Never again. Then a crowd scene came up again, and the lens wandered roughly for a moment, gaining ground, before, surprisingly, it stopped on her. Emiko saw herself 25 years younger, standing in that long dispersed riot of people. The camera focused on her standing there, her hair much longer, fewer wrinkles gathered around that map of shiny skin on the left side of her face, and for a moment she was surprised, almost delighted by this coincidence, this random luck. The camera moved closer. She saw herself blink and notice, not him, but the camera itself. She stepped away then, whether in embarrassment or irritation, she couldn't now tell, into a large group of people. But the camera trailing after her was no mistake. She could tell that from here, suddenly, and her feeling of curious delight spoiled. This had been neither a coincidence nor a random act. She turned to him, the question on her tongue. He smiled and nodded yes. The images continued in front of them. The light fell over their faces. Sophie standing proudly beside a topiary scene in some English garden of a fox hunt. Then a younger Emiko appeared again and again. Different memorials, different clothing, different hair. "But I found you," she said. "I let this happen. I waited for you. I knew you would find me one day. I saw you there, always waiting. So for years and years I waited for you to come and tell me who you were." She was silent, shocked, trying to comprehend this. He'd been playing with her, she saw, all along, and she had let herself get sucked into this old man's strange fascination, but still did not know why. The nervous fright had seized her body years before, during the television show, threatened now to return, its monstrous, hulking frame bearing down upon her. She placed an open hand against her stomach. How long had he waited for her? She had seen decades up there, decades of being spied on, documented, displayed like the insides of a lab rat. "I don't know what this means," she said. "Stay there." She raised her hand and held it between them. "It means our lives are connected in ways you could never dream of. I want to know why you followed me. When you finally came to me this summer, I knew then you were ready to hear what I have to say. I'd seen you in Los Angeles. I was in that audience, one of the guests, the people scheduled to appear. But finally I refused. I panicked, but I did stay to watch what happened. I saw you behind that screen. I'd always known I would tell you what I knew, but not then, not at that moment, because I wasn't able. No, I decided to wait as long as I had to." She was afraid to provoke his desperation. There were the cryptic workings of an unbalanced mind, she thought, edging away. The density of the bushes between where she stood and the street meant that she would have to pass through the house in order to leave quickly. "To tell me what?" "That you were there because of me." "I know that." "No, no," he smiled. "You don't know." He rose from his chair and slipped another reel onto the projector arm. In a moment Emiko's old house came up, its destroyed front, the tossed trees and bushes and smashed windows. "What is this?" The hand that held the camera, jolting from side to side, walked in the front door. It jumped awkwardly as it was taken down from the shoulder and placed somewhere. The kitchen counter, she thought. Yes. Then was picked up again and focused on her grandfather, standing rigidly at attention. He bowed to the man holding the camera, straightened up, and waited, unsmiling, in front of a low table set with bowls of rice as the camera was propped up once more. Anton, still youthful and handsome, that same big head of hair, but dark, walked into view and shook the old man's hand and bowed. After they sat down, Emiko's grandfather began to pray. She knew his every gesture, the touch and smell of his skin as it would have been, as it had been, almost rising to her nose, and when he finished he held out the bowl to his guest, and slowly, without speaking, they started to eat. Suddenly the sheet went white, and the tail end of the film was flapping against the projector. They faced each other under the glow. "I went back for your grandfather's sake. I gave him hope in the last years of his life that you might lead a normal life. It was his wish. I would have walked away. I never would have put your name down on that list without his blessing. It was your grandfather's will, after seeing your brother die, after watching helplessly. He deserved the opportunity." And Miko stared at him from her chair. "Put my name down?" "I'd helped him at the hospital where you and your brother were being treated. That is how I came to know him. He could not bear his grandson's suffering. He was a man of medicine, yet could do nothing. No one could. We each had enough English to communicate. He did not want the same to happen to you. For you there was still hope." He removed a reel from the wooden box, slipped it on the projector. In a moment an adolescent Emiko, speaking into the camera in Japanese, addressed the camera directly. "My name is Emiko Ame. My age is 15. I would like to go to America for surgery. My grandfather also wants me to go to America. I know this will be very difficult, and I am prepared to be strong. I think life can be better for us when our faces are restored." Off screen to her right, an American voice. "How many months did you spend in the hospital after the bombing?" A Japanese voice translated this for her. 14 months and 7 days. She looked at the voice off screen. "Look at the camera, please." She turned her head back. "Do you know these procedures will mean more time in the hospital? There will be more operations." "Yes." "Some of these operations will be painful." "Yes." "You are willing to undergo these painful operations?" "Yes." "Have you ever been outside of Hiroshima?" "No." "What do you think you will miss the most if you go to America?" "My grandfather." "Anything else?" "No." "Are you afraid of what might happen to you there?" She hesitated, shielding her face from the camera, then turned back. No. What do you want to be when you grow up? I don't know. Think hard, Emiko. Anything? What dreams do you have? I have no dreams. We all have dreams. My dream is to wake up. Silently she stared into the camera. Then a chair off-screen scraped against the floor, followed by a nervous cough. Thank you, Emiko. She stood and left her seat. The screen went blank. Then a scarred girl whom Emiko didn't recognize appeared and was taking her place when Anton switched off the machine. Do you see, he said. I brought you here. I gave you your face back. No, Bernard, Simon, the other surgeons. They made your face, yes. It was their hands, their skill, but you were there because of my intervention. I got you in the program. You would not have been considered otherwise. Thousands of girls prayed for such a chance. My grandfather took me to the doctors as soon as the Hiroshima papers announced the program. It was on the radio. Everybody knew. He asked me if I wanted to try these new techniques. He asked you this afterwards, after I contacted him, after I assured him that this was possible. Your grandfather wanted every chance to be given you. I went in 1954 as an observer of the program, 9 years after my work there with the Manhattan District. I saw your grandfather again. I sought him out because I remembered him so well, and you. I told him about what the doctors could do, that I could find you a place among them. The other girls, you were not simply chosen. I picked you. You were there because of me, Emiko. I put you there. I gave you this new life. Who you are is because of me. That was you with the camera? These were made for evaluation purposes. For you, a formality. I had already seen to it that you were accepted. Yes, that was me. Her head shifted slightly. Fear rode up her arms and spine, the danger of surprise. Why? Because I remembered you, Emiko. I saw you there, in your bed. Soon I knew you were your grandfather's only surviving relative. I had worked with him. I felt I knew him. It was one thing I could do. He was the only man I always remembered. I could not forget him. There was a pause. The last of the moon descended into the lake. The air turned from black to blue. She sat silently, held within its cool grip. He was the only person I knew there. When I heard about the teams of surgeons and the interviews to decide on the best candidates, I went thinking of you. I'd met one of the surgeons at a conference at the new school. He was interested in radiation burns, so he obliged me. There were thousands of eligible girls. For them, you were as good as any. They didn't care who. You were all the same for their purposes. But they told me your scars could be repaired, and I told your grandfather. He was thankful. He knew it was your only chance at a new life. Who are you? She asked. Who are you to do that? The accusation came with a violence he had not anticipated. But this was done for you. This was giving back what had been taken from you, as much as possible. Who gave you that right? It was not anyone's right. It was a gift. As I said, I wouldn't have continued without your grandfather's approval, without your approval in the end. You consented. You were not pushed. But I knew nothing of this. I had never had any idea my life would be given over to your need to reconcile yourself with what you'd done. This was my opportunity to give something back. So much had been taken from you. I needed to help any way I could. Only a small gesture, a moment of grace. You would deny me that? You would have been left back there, don't you see? Your life would be different. You would be horribly scarred. Still that little girl. Forever that little girl. You kidnapped my life. This was your freedom. You don't understand what I did for you. But it wasn't for me. You did this for yourself. You were given a second chance, while thousands of others weren't. What does it matter, my motivation? I gave you your chance." She was silent. "You're right. I gave both of us something, yes. But is a father selfish when he gives his daughter a gift because he enjoys the smile on her face? There is pleasure in giving. Of course I felt that. But you created all this. You manipulated me. I had no choice, no understanding. I gave you freedom, Emiko. This is your life," she said. He stood his head. "You robbed me of the last precious thing I had." She stared at him. "You went back to Japan to ease your conscience, to help one of thousands. Helping one doesn't erase the memory of the thousands you didn't." "No," he said, "but it is one person. That person didn't want your help. I am telling you the truth. It is a certain truth. Naturally, I thought you would want to know the hand that has directed your fate. I wanted you to stop wondering. This is my gift to you."